Well, as I said before, happy first Sunday in November. Can you believe that we are here already? We are here in November. For some reason, it feels like Halloween was like 6 months ago already. But we just enjoyed Halloween, and because my kids are a little bit older now, we expanded our trick-or-treating. We went to new territory this year. We went around a few extra blocks and some new houses with some extra big candy bars and of course my kids are getting their annual lesson on what taxes are by the acquisition of their implementation of the dad tax. That being said, I'm doing my best to continue to lose some weight. I lost 10 pounds despite all the candy in my house this week. It's crazy. I'm serious. I'm not even kidding. I was impressed with myself. That's pretty good. But speaking of losing weight, we are now entering the hardest season in which to do that. The holiday season is upon us. Christmas is on its way. If you watch television at all, you know Christmas is on its way. It's like every other commercial now is a Christmas commercial. But obviously, before we get to Christmas, we have an even bigger holiday in my heart. The biggest festivity of the year in my book is the holiday of Thanksgiving. I love Thanksgiving, and honestly, if I were to give you my top 3 holidays of the year, Thanksgiving is easily in the mix of the top 3. I love Thanksgiving. I love the other 2 are Independence Day and New Year's Eve. And I know you're probably looking at me like, what? You're a pastor? And you don't include Christmas or Easter in your top 3 holidays of the year? Oh, I guess it's time to find a new church, right? What is wrong with you? Don't get me wrong. I love Easter and I love Christmas. I also love the lesser recognized Christian holidays like Palm Sunday and Good Friday and Maundy Thursday and even the Day of Epiphany. That's a great one. You should keep that one on your calendar. That's actually I think it's the first Sunday we gather in January is the Day of Epiphany. I love all of my Christian holidays, but do you know what the big Christian holidays are for someone like me? Do you know what they are? They're work days. They're work days. They're days with big expectations for pastors. They're days when I'm expected to perform at my peak, to be at my best, to be the most attentive to the needs of my congregation. Do you know how I come to determine my list of favorite holidays? Well, there's two requirements. One, I don't have to be working on those on the holiday if it's under my top 3 list. I can't be working. And B, number 2, it has to be celebrated with a plethora of food, guilt-free eating and drinking and merriment. No one judges you when you overindulge on New Year's Eve. It's just expected, isn't it? No one judges you when you crush 2 hot dogs and a few burgers straight off the grill on Independence Day, do they? They're just like, it's Independence Day. Do what you want to do. Who cares about the diet, right? No one thinks twice about it. And not a living soul will ever judge a red-blooded American for consuming far more calories than their bodies can handle on Thanksgiving. It has never happened. You've never been judged for over-consuming on Thanksgiving. How else are we to induce that late afternoon coma at Grandma's house, right? I love Thanksgiving. I love everything about it. I love the history of Thanksgiving. I love the spirit of Thanksgiving, and I especially love the meal which is served as the centerpiece to nearly every Thanksgiving celebration around this country. And you know what else? I think Jesus, if he were physically present with us here, right now, I think he'd agree with me. I think he'd agree with me. All that being said, we're kicking off a new series this morning. This is going to be another short one, just like the Stranger Things series was for Halloween. We're just going to have 4 sermons in this series. We're going to go through the 4 Sundays of November, and in the 4 Sundays of November, we're going to look at a handful of the most famous scenes from Jesus' ministry in which he shared a meal with people. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Luke, is not shy about revealing the fact that Jesus loved to eat. He loved to eat. Now, if I were to speak more accurately, he loved to eat and to drink with people. That's what he loved. He loved the sharing of meals and breaking of bread and consuming of food. in the presence of other people who are doing the same thing. The Gospel of Luke, in particular, is particularly fond of the stories surrounding Jesus sharing a meal with people. In fact, a well-known commentator on the subject, a professor by the name of Robert Karras, he's listed and highlighted in your handout here this morning. He published a fairly exhaustive book on this very theme of Jesus and the meals he shared throughout the Gospel of Luke. And he wrote these words in the introduction. He says, in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is always either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. That is the outline of Luke's Gospel. If you didn't know that, read through it with that lens in mind, and you will undeniably see it. Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from one. There's really no in between in Luke's Gospel. Jesus loved food, but even more so, he loved sharing food with other people. And Luke, more so than any of the other gospel writers, made a point to share just how much Jesus loved to eat. In fact, in Luke chapter 7, we read these words, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking." Now, there's more to that text, and we're going to talk about that in the future. But for now, it's simply important for us to recognize just how much Jesus' ministry centered around the sharing of a meal and a shared table with other people. The reason for this is pretty straightforward. It's a straightforward truth which we even know on a subconscious level. A shared meal is a shared life. A shared meal is a shared life. Think about this for a minute. How do we celebrate just about every holiday, every birthday, every major milestone in life? We celebrate it with a meal, don't we? We share a meal with others. Aaron and I just enjoyed a wedding last night. After the official ceremony, how did we celebrate the couple's marriage? With a meal. We enjoyed a meal with about 100 different people. We even grieve through food. What do we do when someone passes away? We greet their loved ones with food at their home, and we gather around a memorial service, which often ends with a meal, oftentimes called a wake. Even if we cannot articulate precisely why we eat these meals together, on a subconscious level, most of us find comfort by breaking bread together and sharing a meal with other people, because that shared meal is reflective of a shared life. And this was particularly true in the past, especially in Jesus' time 2,000 years ago. Today, when we want to share a meal with someone else, we don't have to do much more than make a reservation at our favorite restaurant. It's really simple. If it's a large group, the worst thing we got to do is call a caterer, right? We just call a caterer and have them cook up something for 100 people. The most work we have to do if we want to actually host somebody in our home and share a home-cooked meal is go to the grocery store, buy the ingredients, and maybe spend a few hours preparing it. That's the most labor-intensive, the most energy we have to expend to share a meal with another person or other people. But that wasn't the case 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, there were very few conveniences to this sort of hospitality and bonding over food. 2,000 years ago, if you wanted to share a meal with your neighbors or share a meal with your family and your friends, there wasn't a Texas Roadhouse to make reservations with or a local butcher shop to grab a few pounds of ribeye. 2,000 years ago, you literally had to raise the cow. You had to raise the cow and slaughter the cow and prepare the cow and then cook the cow before you could share that cow with your closest friends and family. That's what made meal sharing, particularly in the Gospels during Jesus' ministry, such a bonding experience, because it was a reflection of pure generosity. It was a reflection of pure generosity. We're not talking about meals ordered via takeout here. We're talking about real blood, sweat, and tears being poured out so that others may have something to eat and share in fellowship with another person. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I mean when I say that in the Gospels, a shared meal represents a shared life. That's why when Jesus comes on the scene, when he started his ministry among the people of his day, he cherished these shared meals. Jesus cherished these shared meals because of the acceptance and the love that they represented. He cherished these meals because of the acceptance and the love that they represented. What I want to do this morning is quickly look at one of the first shared meals mentioned by Luke in his gospel. It's a very eye-opening encounter as it demonstrates the life-changing power when we're willing to embrace other people with the acceptance and love of God expressed through Jesus Christ. So let's take a look at our story found in Luke chapter 5. It's a very short story. We're going to add a little bit of commentary at the end, but it's very applicable to our discussion here this morning. Beginning in Luke 5, verse 27, Luke writes this. He says, we're going to start with the words after this. Of course, when Luke writes those words after this, I need to give you some context. Here we are in the very early stages of Jesus' ministry. So when Luke says after this, he's referring to, he's pointing us back to Jesus calling his first disciples and some very early miracles in Jesus' ministry. He's starting to collect a followership. People are starting to turn their attention to Jesus. He hasn't ruffled feathers quite yet. That's about to happen. But Jesus is starting to show up. He's starting to make a name for himself. And Luke says, after this, all of this has happened, Jesus went out and he saw a tax collector by the name of Levi. He was sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." I love this story. It's short, it's succinct, but it is so ripe and so powerful. It's a powerful scene which sets the stage for the contrasting viewpoints of who God is and what his kingdom is all about, these viewpoints held by Jesus versus the viewpoints held by the religious leaders of his day. And rather than getting into all of that right now, I want to start by getting our head around the scene as it is described. I want to make sure you fully grasp the context of the story that Luke is telling to his original audience. Jesus at this point is out in Galilee. He's teaching and he's doing ministry around the Sea of Galilee. And he's teaching people. He's healing people. He's even casting out demons already at this point. He's starting to generate that following I mentioned. And the religious leaders of his day, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and any rabbi of any interest in teaching would have taken notice. He would have taken notice of Jesus by this point. He's identifying and he's already calling out his earliest disciples. Earlier in Luke 5, we see him calling out Peter, James, and John. While going about his business, continuing on with his ministry, he stumbles upon this guy named Levi, who's described to us as a tax collector. Now, you know Levi more likely through his Greek name, which is Matthew. Levi is his Hebrew name. Matthew is his Greek name. He becomes one of Jesus' disciples. He even pens the first gospel in your New Testament. So when you open the New Testament to the first gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, it is written by this man named Levi. So clearly, Jesus had a transformative impact on this man's life. The question is, why? The question is, how? Unlike perhaps some of his other disciples, Levi was a wealthy man. He was a tax collector. And as a tax collector, Levi had a very powerful and very lucrative career. That being said, what Levi might have taken for granted in terms of profits and powerful political connections, he lacked in terms of friends and even colleagues, or not friends and even family who might have rejected him by this point. Levi's life would have absolutely been a very lonely life. He was despised by the vast majority of his fellow Jews, and for one reason and one reason only: his job. I mean, I don't like tax collectors as it is. None of us do, right? None of us likes the tax collector when they send us their letters or their bills or whatever the case may be. But in this day and age, as a tax collector, Levi was not only not liked, he was despised. He was considered a traitor to his fellow Jews and Israelites. He was absolutely rejected. Levi was not only responsible for collecting the taxes owed by the people of his community, he was sending those taxes not to Jerusalem, not to the temple, not to the powers that be in Israel. He was sending those taxes off to Rome. He was appointed by Rome to collect these taxes, a foreign oppressor of the people of Israel. And he made his own personal living by adding to the tax bill that every Israelite and Jewish man would have paid during this time. Levi would not have been paid a salary by the Romans for the job that he was doing. As far as Rome was concerned, they gave him a title and a responsibility. That is it. How he made his living was his responsibility. And the way all tax collectors made their living was simply by doing this. If you owed $100 in taxes, guess what? You're actually going to pay me $150. Because 50 of those dollars are staying in my pocket, and 100 are going off to Rome. He couldn't be charged for extortion. He was immune from prosecution for taking more than his quote-unquote fair share. He was empowered by Rome to operate this way. And frankly, because most of their fellow Jews hated him anyway, the tax collectors took as much as they could in order to make what they did for a living bearable. I mean, if they're going to be rejected and they're going to be lonely and they're going to be isolated, they might as well be rich while they did it. So they continued to persecute the Jews, persecute the Israelites by taking and taking and taking. Now, Jesus, at this point, is roughly 30 years old. He's just kicked off his ministry. He's 30 years old. He's a working man at this point. He would have spent at least half of his life to this point taking up his father's trade as a carpenter or builder. And as a working man, he would have absolutely been all too familiar with the value of a dollar. Of course, I wouldn't have called it a dollar, but you get my point. He would have understood the value of labor. And he would have absolutely known what the tax collector was all about and what they were doing. He would have been all too familiar with the corruption of tax collection in the Roman system in Israel. That's what makes his approach to Levi so powerful. Jesus approached Levi, who was sitting in his tax booth. He's likely, I imagine in my mind's eye, Levi sitting in his tax booth, and he's just counting his latest collection, right? And he's being cursed at, and he's being spit at by the locals who walk by him as he's counting his riches. Now, we don't read this in the text, but if you look between the lines, I have to imagine that Jesus was probably one of the first people in years to look Levi directly in the eye and to treat him as the human being he was. Jesus was more than likely the first person since his own mother to have enough compassion for him and love for him to interact with him as a man, to interact with him as a human being, rather than being treated like the rabid dog that most Israelites treated him as. Jesus was living out that which he would soon teach just a chapter later in Luke chapter 6, where Jesus says, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. I imagine when he said these words, he probably looked at Levi when he said these words a chapter later. This is the upside down ways of God's kingdom in action through Jesus' ministry. Those whom the world says we should hate, those whom the world says we should judge, those whom the world says we should condemn, Jesus commands us to love and to embrace with a spirit of grace. This approach immediately lowers people's defenses. It immediately opens people up to the message of hope we have to offer. And it often leads to an immediately changed life, as evidenced by Levi. Just look at the way Levi changed and responded to Jesus' invitation. Luke said that Levi immediately got up and immediately followed Jesus, and he left everything behind. He left everything behind. He left his work. He left the taxes he collected that day. He left the profits that he had earned that day. He left his responsibilities to the Roman government that day. Levi literally left everything. The way Levi responds to Jesus is reminiscent of the way Peter, James, and John responded to Jesus. You remember that story? That's a famous story in which Peter, James, and John were out fishing, and Jesus says, come and follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. And they literally dropped their nets, and when they dropped their nets, what the gospel writers are telling us is they left their means of income, they left their businesses, they left their families even. Levi didn't have the family. He didn't have the friends necessarily. But he left all that he had. He left all that he had. And so the next thing we're told is that Levi holds this great banquet at his home in Jesus' honor. Levi's meal was a dinner of overwhelming gratitude and praise. That's what it was. It was a meal of overwhelming gratitude and praise. Levi's life was forever changed by the simple fact that Jesus looked him in the eye, accepted him, and invited him to follow him. That is all it took to celebrate what Jesus, this man who is just getting started, who's just starting out in his ministry, to celebrate what this Jesus did for Levi. He invited Jesus to his home along with a multitude of his friends who, for obvious reasons, were also tax collectors. Remember I said he probably only had a handful of friends. They all did the same work. Misery likes company, right? So these guys were like, well, we're all in the same boat, so we might as well be friends with one another. And he invites them over for what had to have been an epic feast. In some of the translations, we're told that it was a great banquet. In others, it's described as a grand reception. In the original Greek, the word simply means feast. In other words, this simply wasn't a meal of cold cuts and potato chips. This wasn't just a quick, little snack to help Jesus regain some of his energy so he can continue on with his ministry. No, this was an all-out celebratory feast. This was a spread of the best food money could buy. Levi left his job, he left his profits, and now he's overspending on the food so that he can celebrate what this man Jesus had done for him. And that's why I think it's fantastic that we read later on in verse 29 from other English translations that those at the feast, we get in the NIV, it says that those at the feast were eating with them, but that's a terrible translation. I hate that translation of the passage in verse 29. The more accurate translation of the word is that they were all reclining together at the table. In other words, they were all so fat and tired from everything that they ate. You know what you feel like after Thanksgiving, right? You know what happens when the recliner chair goes up and you've had the pumpkin pie, you've had the turkey, you've had the stuffing, you've had it all. You've consumed 6,000 calories. And your body simply can't handle it anymore. So what happens? You start to shut down. You slip into this little coma because your body's trying to pull all of its energy into your stomach, just to digest that which you put in it. So you're falling asleep. That's what's happening in this scene where all these men are gathered around Levi's table. They've all overeaten. They've all overconsumed. They've had more than their fill. And now they're tired. They're tired. I imagine that Levi and his friends were just drunk, not drunk alcoholically, but drunk with food and lazy at this point and just sluggish, barely moving. And that's when the Pharisees, that's when the religious leaders, that's when they look in the window, they see Jesus, they see these guys, and they ask that question, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why is he basically looking like a drunkard and a glutton? Why? I think it's fascinating to me that the Pharisees and the religious leaders, their initial reaction, their first criticism of Jesus isn't about what he's eating or how he's eating it. It's not about any of that stuff. It's about whom he is enjoying the food with. That's what they care about. Because these religious leaders and these Pharisees have had their endless meals. They've had their epic feasts. They've had their drunken debauchery-filled nights. They've all had those. They don't care. They're not going to judge Jesus on that because they're like, we've all been there. What they criticize him for is who he's doing it with. While the religious leaders cursed Levi, demanding he change before they ever embrace him, Jesus immediately changed Levi's life by embracing him. That's why they asked him, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? And I love Jesus' response. It's classic Jesus, right? It's one of the most famous lines of Jesus's that we have all memorized sometime in our Christian life. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. In the eyes of the religious leaders, in the eyes of the Pharisees, there's two types of people in this world. Those who are worthy of your time and attention because of their self-made righteousness, because of their religiosity, and those who are unworthy because they're unclean and they're sinful. Those are the two groups of people in the Pharisees' eyes, and Jesus says that's not good enough. That's not good enough. The religious leaders and the Pharisees spent their lives cursing and spitting at men like Levi and people like him. They burned years of time and untold amounts of energy demanding that Levi change, demanding that Levi repent, demanding that he experience some sort of life change before they would ever consider inviting them into a meal of fellowship with them. Yet here we are witnessing Levi and his fellow tax collectors at a shared meal with Jesus within moments of their meeting, all because Jesus simply treated them like human beings. Levi's meal is proof of the transformative power of grace and love. His meal is proof of the transformative power of grace and love. Paul once wrote in Romans 15, "Accept one another then, just as Christ accepted you." Accept one another just as Christ accepted you in order to bring praise to God. There are people in your life whom you keep at arm's length. There are people in your life whom you refuse to interact with in any meaningful way. There are likely even people in your life who your first instinct is to judge and to criticize. And it's okay to admit it. I'm right there with you. I'm talking to myself as much as I'm talking to you. Let me ask you this simple question. This is the question I've been wrestling with too as I reflected on this story. How long has it been? How much time have you burned waiting on that person or those people to change before you'll accept them? How much energy have you spent insisting that those people or that person make different choices, insisting that they choose a different path before you'll welcome them into your life? What if you changed your strategy? What if you approached them with grace and love? What if you looked at them and interacted with them as human beings, as equals, rather than as broken, sinful people? What if you stopped staring down at them, insisting they pick themselves up, and instead bent down to help them up? Maybe if we're willing to change our approach, the next big meal that we enjoy, that next big banquet we attend, will be the one in which we're celebrating their conversion, their baptism, their life being transformed as a result of the grace and the love of God being poured through you into them. Let me be clear. I'm not suggesting you willingly walk repeatedly into dysfunctional or abusive relationships. I'm not saying that you don't need to keep up, keep up barriers where barriers are needed just for your own well-being. All I'm saying is that if you approach people, all people, with a spirit of grace, with the spirit of love that Jesus approached them with, rather than criticism and judgment like the Pharisees, you're far more likely to witness the sort of life transformation we see in Levi as a result of Jesus' gracious embrace and his simple invitation. And finally, I'm just thankful we worship a God who considers us worthy. He considers us worthy of lowering himself to our level, to look us in the eyes and invite us all into his eternal embrace, regardless of the sin and the brokenness within us all. Let's all be more like Jesus. Let's go to him now in a word of prayer.